a little risk. Send lawyers, guns, and money. Dad, get me out of this. Ha!
So let me just say a word about music, okay? Music's very important to us on this show. It's important on a lot of shows. And there are times when I personally give it a lot of thought. And so I had thought that if things had... This is so sad. If things had turned out differently last night, if things had turned out more conclusively the way that I had hoped that they would turn out, if in fact it was very clear that Joe Biden was the next president of the United States, I was going to open the show today with the Bob Dylan song, Ring Them Bells, although I was going to use the I'm With Her version of Ring Them Bells. Even though, like a lot of Bob Dylan songs, I don't really know what it's about, but it's sort of about ringing them bells anyway, which also kind of conjures up England England on VE Day. During the war, they didn't ring church bells in Britain, and then on VE Day, all the bells rang. Anyway, you see where I was going with all this. Oh, so anyway, that's not where we are at all right now. We're with Lawyers, Guns, and Money, which is probably a pretty good guide to the next 4 or 5 days, if not more, in Michigan, and maybe other places as well. So that tells you that. And then let me tell you one other thing, which is that on the day after the 2016 election, we had the certain lineup, which we are bringing back today, although the one exception being Azar Nafisi, the great writer about Iran, and just an amazing person. She was with us that day, and she is unable to join today. She sends her best. Azar is always great to talk to at times like this, because it's kind of like she, as bad as things are, she's kind of thinking, yeah, but Iran, it's not Iran after the Islamic Revolution, right? It's not that. And I think she would probably still think that, but we don't know. We'll get her on as soon as we can. She said she does send her best wishes, and I'm sure she will join us soon. But we are also very lucky to have back the other two gentlemen who joined us on our first show, and then our first show after the 2016 election, whom I will introduce in 2 seconds. And I will just tell you that the role of Azar Nafisi on the show today is played by Chris Murphy, who will be joining us later on in the show. So joining us right now is David Folkenflik, NPR's media correspondent. He joins us through the miracle of Skype. Michael Lynch is a professor of philosophy and director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Connecticut, and the author of Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. And so, Michael, I'll have you get us going here. And, as has become your want, you are looking for traces of humanity and civilization and things like that, and civilizedness. So give us some tiny little silver linings right now.
Well, you're right. I'm always trying to look for some traces of humanity. Sometimes, I have to admit, over the last 4 years, in fact, a lot of the time, it's been really hard to always find those traces, or at least to find them as frequently as you'd like. But I guess I'd love to start out by just noting two things that I'm thankful for. There's a lot that I'm not thankful for, and a lot of deep anxiety that we're all going through. But it might be helpful, given all that anxiety, free-floating anxiety, which seems to be part of our existential just existence right now, which last night did not help with. Two things I'm thankful for. First, just the fact that there's been lots of turnout. The most massive turnout in an American presidential election in several generations. It's really, I think, that is important, because people who vote for the first time, many of people were voting for the first time in this election. I was standing at the polls myself, waving a Biden sign and helping some of the local Democrats at some point, and I was delighted to see so many people coming up, passing us and saying, yeah, I'm not here to vote for the first time. The fact is that people who voted yesterday, those folks, and for the first time will probably vote again. And that's good for democracy. And then the other thing I just want to point out is that we should be thankful for is that there wasn't a lot of violence. There's still unfortunately plenty of time for disturbance to happen. But although there were isolated incidents, the election has gone on so far peacefully. And I think that's also something sort of sad to have to say this, but it's something that I'm thankful for right now.
Right. It could be accused of being a low bar to clear. We had an election.
It is incredibly low bar to clear.
We didn't shoot at each other.
And as we'll no doubt have time to return to throughout today's show, we've the bar has gotten pretty low right now with American democracy. The fact that, who would have thought? I certainly would have, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said, I thought to myself, well, here's a good thing. Not too many people, killed each other yesterday during the election in the United States of America. That's bizarre that we have to say that, but here, I'm thankful for it anyway.
It does put me in mind of a former Hartford police chief who, in explaining police behavior when they arrested Ken Krajewski, who was kind of a journalist and crusader, he said, it's not as if we electrocuted him. And I thought, well, no, that's true, Daryl. You did not electrocute Ken Krajewski. All right. So, David, another thing that's good about a democracy is a functioning press. And not for the first time, the first time being really right after the 2016 election, and I think a lot of journalists are saying to ourselves, do we know how to do our jobs? I feel like I've been playing in the NBA, but I've been kicking the ball because I didn't know. You're not supposed to. There's just sort of a sense in which on these occasions, when reality doesn't map well at all onto previous expectations, I find, and I start reading articles by David Folkenflik and Margaret Sullivan and Eric Boehlert, and I think, maybe, do we know how to do our jobs? That's a pretty bad question to ask you, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Well, I hope so. You want to keep working in this trade, right? I think that we can acknowledge two things at the same time. I think that the projections and the expectations that were set were, even though we offer all kinds, and by we, I mean journalists, offer all kinds of caveats and say, look, there are margins of error. And also, let's be humble because of 2016. And we didn't really get everything quite right there, although it might not have been as bad as you thought it was. Those aren't looking great right now. And I'm not saying that they're not looking great whether or not Biden wins, but there are a bunch of sort of key states that really badly performed against what the blend of reputable polls that were presented by such high-profile polling gurus as the New York Times and Nate Cohn there, or Nate Silver and 538, Harry Enton and CNN. These are smart, decent, good people who actually are pretty transparent, working through things online with you and explaining how they get there. But there's kind of a certitude being presented. And to simply say to folks, look, it's 75% likely that Biden wins such and such, or that Democrats hold on to the Senate, and then say, well, we said it was 1 in 4 that it wouldn't happen. So that's a big chance too. And so if it happens, we didn't get it wrong. It's like, my best friend from childhood called me up last night. He said, I remembered when we were in high school and you said, listen, when the weather forecaster tells you there's a 50% chance of rain, it means he doesn't want to be thought of as getting it wrong. All of these things are possible, but we know as adults that all these things are possible. If things are presented as prescriptive rather than descriptive, I think for polls along the way this fall, I think that they end up really kind of misleading the public. The second thing is, so I think that's a problem, and that's baked into this sort of soberness and the confusion that you saw playing out on the analysts, whether it was, Steve Kornacki, who I think is pretty great on MSNBC, John King's very good, or you have, Major Garrett on CBS, Bill Hemmer on Fox News, the like. The second thing I got to say is, for last night anyway, I thought there was a professionalism that obtained, even on Fox, which is in some ways, given the question of whether Trump would lose, the most important outlet for both the president's state of mind and for the framing that is absorbed by so many of his supporters and people who fan out from that in the conservative media. I thought it was pretty professional. I thought people tried hard to keep to facts. There was some punditry for sure, but I thought that when the president misspoke, look, it took Chris Wallace stepping into the breach a number of times on Fox to knock down the president's claims and claims of his surrogates. But I think people were presented with realism. But as I tried to indicate in a column I wrote yesterday for NPR, this isn't election night, as we now know. This is election week. And the question is, what happens today, tomorrow, Friday? What messages do people hear in the media? How tightly professional or how speculative or how willing are people to indulge outside voices to just make claims that have no basis? Newt Gingrich came on Fox and Friends this morning and talked about not the possibility, not the potential, but the probability of fraud in votes because Joe Biden was adding thousands or tens of thousands of votes to his count in key states in the upper Midwest, suggesting this was sort of magical thinking and fraud. That's not, this was actually kind of pretty likely to happen given the nature of the precincts that we're starting to report. So, I really think the question is, how are we doing this week so that people can absorb what happens regardless of who wins in a way that people understand that their institutions are not uniformly failing them?
Michael, building on everything that David said, and I agree with everything that David said, and I agree about the professionalism of last night. Although at a certain point, Steve Kornacki, who I've interviewed, and I know him to be a very nice and very smart person, he seemed a little bit like a manager at Applebee's coming back to your table to tell you that your entrees will be out any minute, except he's already told you that 2 or 3 times. But Michael, there's
the nicest, most earnest Applebee's manager ever, though. I mean, let's be clear.
And absolutely,
very decent Applebee's manager.
Knows what temperature. Knows exactly what temperature your chicken fingers are being cooked at, and the likelihood that they will be ready within the next 3 minutes. Okay, so, but Michael, there's another way in which I feel kind of something broke down here. It's not just the press's inability to, use polling information that was reliable in order to create a framework for understanding what's going to happen. There's sort of a deeper problem too that, I guess that if you're the president and you don't do much about, for example, a pandemic and 230,000 of your citizens die, and then you wrap up your campaign, your closing message of your campaign is that you're going to fire Dr. Fauci, and this campaign was rigged anyway. I'll see you Tuesday. That they're just, when you look at so many aspects of President Trump, and he's just not presidential. And I find myself thinking, well, there's just kind of no way people can go along with this, particularly this whole pandemic thing. And I guess that's another thing, another way in which I feel like I don't understand reality anymore, because clearly it's not as big a problem as I had thought it was going to be for him.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about it that, one of the things that we learned, right, and this is going to remain the case no matter who wins. One of the things that we really are taking away from this is that the information bubbles that, we talked about 4 years ago, they've really hardened into concrete bunkers of information. That is to say that another way of putting that is you say, well, I don't recognize reality. Well, in a sense, to speak very loosely, which reality? It's clear, much more clear now, I think, than it was just a couple of days ago, just how deeply entrenched voters are on their different views of the world. The idea that, I think in sort of in past norms, past expectations would have got us thinking, just as you said, that look, we're right in the middle of the worst crisis that has hit the country for certainly since 9/11, in many ways far more than that since World War II. In terms of death, this is a tremendous crisis, and yet to a large bulk of the public, it either is a hoax or is just not as important as other things to them, particularly matters having to do presumably with their identity. I think one of the things that's another thing that this really illustrates is that our political convictions are now first reflecting our identities. They're the product of our identities. And therefore, when people attack our political convictions, we not surprisingly take it personally because they are reflecting our identities. And secondly, we're incorporating more and more of life, of reality into our identities. What I mean by that is just what we were talking about. Increasingly, the pandemic itself, its very existence, has become part of an identity to certain people, much like climate change. Is it real? Well, for some people, if you say that it's real, that indicates that you are sort of you have announced a hostile view towards their own identity, an identity which is wrapped up with the view that climate change is not real and perhaps the pandemic is not real. When things get like that, when social media information bubbles become so hardened that they actually are A, reflecting our identities, and B, spreading to all sorts of issues which don't on the surface seem anything to do with politics, that is health, climate, things of that sort, I think it's perhaps not surprising that we get a lot of surprises in polling data. I mean, you look back, if we had really taken seriously how entrenched these political convictions and cultural identities are, then we might begin to realize that, yeah, actually, Trump's strategy was a good one. Double down on the base and get people out to vote, motivate them based on those convictions that reflect their identity, to see this as a threat of a war of good against evil, and get them out to the polls.
So, David Folkenflik, let's go right to one of the areas where I think we have some concern here, which is that no sooner had we digested that the evening was going to go maybe differently than we thought, then we already knew that Trump was going to say some stuff, and he had already telegraphed what kind of stuff it was going to be. Nonetheless, because he's the president and it's a presidential election, it's kind of hard to argue against putting it on the air, although some people are doing exactly that. But let's listen to President Trump speaking last night. I believe this is a kind of an edited version here, but speaking last night in the 2 a.m. Eastern Time hour.
Millions and millions of people voted for us tonight, and a very sad group of people is trying to disenfranchise that group of people, and we won't stand for it. We will not stand for it. We're winning Michigan, but I'll tell you, I looked at the numbers. I said, whoa. I said, wow, that's a lot. And we're winning Wisconsin. And I said, we're winning. We don't need all of them. We won states, and all of a sudden, I said, what happened to the election? It's off. And we have all these announcers saying, what happened? And then they said, oh. And all of a sudden, everything just stopped. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
So, David, I mean, we could parse this quote forever, and there are all kinds of things. There's so many things that are wrong in it. But, I mean, one question is, do you even just run it without saying some stuff beforehand? Like, we're about to play a clip by the president, but it's like it's full of stuff that's not true. Even if some of the stuff were true, like if everything just stopped, he'd lose. He's behind on electoral votes.
Right, he spoke.
Go ahead.
He spoke last night, or excuse me, I say last night, but it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was up till about 4:30 this morning. So, I wanted to make sure to watch it and see how the outlets handled it, because that really frames it for those people who are watching. And one question I had, one thing I've suggested over the years is, at a certain point with the president's misleading statements and lies, it might be worth, this is me talking, not NPR talking, but might be worth taping the president, running him at a slight delay so that you have the ability to slap up chyrons or stop time and say, this actually is not a true statement, but we'll go, he's actually X or Y, on really flagrant statements. You let certain things go for rhetoric, but really flagrant statements. People didn't do that. And last night, NBC, MSNBC dumped out of his remarks and contradicted him in terms of the claims he made about the states he was winning. They said that's just not true. And it's become even less true as the hours have elapsed since his statements. But even in the moment he was speaking, a lot of what he said about certain key swing states weren't true. Or if they become true, ultimately, they weren't true at the time he said it, and there was no way he could be clear on that. Secondly, let's think about the role of the president. The president is the head of government, and the president is a politician by definition, whomever that might be. The president is also head of state. And that's, so, you're combining in what Britain would be the prime minister and the queen's roles, right? And that sounds like kind of highfalutin political, political science or political philosophy way of thinking about it. But given that the president is the head of state, he or she has an extraordinary responsibility to help preserve the integrity of the electoral process and the integrity of people's perception and respect for that process. What you heard in that clip from about 11 hours ago, as you and I are talking live at this moment, was the head of state of the United States undermining his supporters, many tens of millions of Americans and other supporters besides, in having faith in the American electoral system. He accused it of fraud. He said people were stealing it. He said it without any evidence or grounds to argue that. And that's incredibly troubling. And that's not a fact check, except for the fact there's no proof for it, but it's also it's almost like a civic ethics check, where there are things that are not partisan, that nonetheless, or not ideological, that nonetheless contradict how this president speaks publicly. And that's really complicated and problematic. I must say that after his remarks, in varying ways, all of the networks had senior figures there dissecting, contradicting, and in fairly brown terms, condemning what the president had to say, which, if he were to win, was also a troubling circumstance. You don't want people who are trying to present straight ahead and non-agenda driven news to the public being thrust in the position of saying this person is damaging the body politic, he is wounding us collectively. But that is what happened.
We run up against a problem that the acid-tongued press critic Jay Rosen, who we're both quite familiar with, brings up time and again, which is, for example, his argument for never putting Kellyanne Conway on television is, does she say things that are true? Does she enlarge our understanding of what's happening? Is she a source of reliable information? And the answer is no, so you never put her on TV. That's his argument. There's a problem when it's the president, right? When anything the president says is at least theoretically news. But it does bump up against Jay's point, right? If you put stuff on the air that's not true, no matter how quickly you counteract it or argue against it or anything, you do feel like you've done some epistemic damage somehow, and that, it's just not what we signed up for, right? If I had a press conference to say that I, a 66-year-old man with bad knees, have run the mile in less than 3 minutes, no one would come to my press conference because I'm obviously lying. But here, we have to put things on the air that we know are lies. And just give me your thoughts, and then we're going to go to break.
Look, we all have seen presidents who spin, seen presidents who mislead, who've seen Bill Clinton lied about having an involvement with an intern many decades his junior. This president does this on a different level, and he does it to damage our understanding of what happens around us. I've argued that his remarks should often be taken on a slight delay so that fact checkers and presenters and anchors can figure out how to frame what's being said. I thought Chris Wallace of Fox News actually did a wonderful job when he presented a lengthy interview with the president, where at certain moments he stopped the interview and in studio presented some fact checking and then went back to the live interview. But, it's hard to pull off. It's hard to do. I do think what the president says is news. I don't think that we abdicate our control over how we decide what we present and how we present it simply by virtue of his office.
All right, let's take a break here. We're going to come back with more of David, although we're going to lose him pretty soon to another station, and Michael Lynch, and eventually we will add Chris Murphy in here too.
Because I really love to count. Sometimes I sit and count all day. But sometimes I get carried away. I count slowly, getting faster. Once I start counting, it's very hard to stop.
So we're back. Thank you for joining us for our quadrennial after the presidential election show. David Folkenflik is NPR's media correspondent. He joins us by Skype. He's got to leave in a few minutes. Michael Lynch is a professor of philosophy and director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Connecticut, and author of Know-It-All: Society, Truth, and Arrogance of Political Culture. So, there's sort of another part of this that I'd like you to both talk a little bit about, because I think underlying everything that happened last night, and Michael, I'm going to have you start, but Jelani Cobb, the great journalist with the New Yorker, tweeted what a lot of people were saying. Absolutely stunning to me that a person with this record of abject failure and 250,000 dead Americans strewn in the background could not only retain support but benefit from a surge in voting. No matter how this turns out, we are in deep trouble collectively. And I will say that the person who lives with me said almost exactly the same thing. Her other line of the night was that this feels like a near-death experience without the comforting white light. But, there's that kind of sense like, well, back to what I was saying before, that there's some kind of departure from civility and norms. And so what does that mean that so many people are willing to join Trump with it? Actually, David, I'm going to have you answer first because I'm just seeing the clock and you got to go pretty soon. So, David, your thoughts first.
Just to be clear, you're trying to get at the question of how is your reality clanging so badly against the wall of what you're seeing play out on TV and online right now.
Right.
Because, look, you live in a fairly blue part of America, and Connecticut was not in doubt, to be sure. And, regardless of what partisan or political affiliations you may have in your privacy of the voting booth, you seem to me, from our exchanges over the years, to adhere to kind of a genial Enlightenment sense of the world, where a certain kind of reason and fact-based approach, even if you have certain instincts and gut impulses, nonetheless, you kind of want to be convinced of certain arguments. And certain people just vote differently than that. And so even if people you see real strength for Trump in certain, for example, farming parts of Iowa, even as their industries have been undercut by a lot of the president's trade policies with China and other major trading partners, right? And yet they feel that he represents what they want in government. And people used to use economic anxiety as shorthand. Some people ascribe racism for an element of it. And any or all of these things may be true. But I think it's a little glib to say those are the only things that are involved. And so, the question is, do we understand our neighbors? Do we understand people who don't live near us as America sorts? There are, we've been talking about this incredible polarization and geographic polarization and the like, but I will say that different states are popping up as swing states and purple states than used to be, and you do see migration of states and their allegiances over the years. So, it's hard to, you have to reconcile these different things that are going on. But the reality is you have to reconcile that your experience, what you see through the lenses of your own lives and your own experiences are not necessarily lives as they're lived elsewhere. And this is the humbling truth that one learns as a reporter when you go out with a microphone or a notebook on assignment and you just sort of put your guard down and talk to people at length. What they take as givens, what they take as obvious, what they take as automatic, sort of foundational truths may be very different than where you're coming from. And the fact that in America, a place that we've expected to experience kind of stability and a degree of significant societal consensus are actually fracturing in ways that the rest of the world are looking at, places that we used to say, hey, let's help you knit together with others in a common goal and for the common good. That's a complicating understanding of what America stands for right now. And I think reporters are up to the task as they pull back for sort of 30,000-foot looks at this. But in the moment, it's very hard to translate in a way that makes sense on the air or online.
All right, David Folkenflik, ask for him by name, accept no substitute. You've got to go talk to your fancy friends at WNYC, but it's been great to have you on.
You bet. We'll talk to you in 4 years, and I hope before then.
Yeah, before then, definitely. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Because I'm too lazy to think of a new question. But that whole idea last night where you suddenly think, And I know people who are Trump voters, and some of them are real jerks, but some of them are, the kind of person who would offer you some hot coffee if you were a poll standing and you looked cold, and you're holding a Biden sign. But I just feel like we're living alongside people whose value sets are so different from one another that it does constitute a problem that's kind of right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, it constitutes a problem because we're not disagreeing just over values anymore. We're not just disagreeing over facts. We're disagreeing over different ways of trying to figure out what the facts are. And once disagreement gets that point, once it gets to the point where we don't even agree on what shared reality is, or even how to determine what shared reality is, it becomes by the very nature of the problem incredibly difficult to understand one another, because we don't have any shared common standards of rationality by which to assess each other's views. And that's a big problem. So, what we might say, to use some fancy language, there's our political and moral values, but there's also our epistemic values, our values about rationality. And at the end of the day, we can say that this is a election that was about both kinds of those political values, but also those epistemic values of rationality. And people have very different sets of values right now. I think it is in a way the sharpening to see this election. On the one hand, we're sort of confused. How could people vote differently than us? And the Trump folks on the Trump side, I know, are thinking the exact same thing. How could it be so close in Wisconsin? People are wondering on both sides. But part of it is also sharpening, because we're realizing that, there really are some fundamental disagreements about very, very basic political and epistemic values going on in this country. And in that sense, this is a cultural election. It is about identity and value. And it's about one side wanting to look, in my view, one part of the electorate wants to look back at what the philosopher Jason Stanley calls the mythic past. They want to think about get America great again, get us back to where we were, to a set of values that they think have been forgotten or trampled on. And then another group which worries about that past and wants and the progressives that want to move in a different direction. That fundamentally is a cultural issue, and it's really been thrown into sharp relief by what's going on now.
Yeah, we're going to go to a break here. I said this morning on the Wheelhouse that, Trump says so little that's coherent and adhesive in terms of policy that it's kind of, hard to say, well, they like him because of this. I do think one thing that they like about him, there's a large swath of America that just kind of doesn't like other countries, doesn't like foreigners, doesn't like immigrants, don't really like treaties, Paris Climate Accords or Iran peace deals or NATO or the World Health Organization or any of that stuff. That stuff can all go screw as far as they're concerned. This is America, and that's what matters. And I do think that that's a group of people who I get it, I guess. It's not what I think. I think it's the opposite of what I think, but maybe we need to work harder on at least understanding that. All right, let's take a quick break. Michael will stay with us. We'll probably have Senator Chris Murphy fairly soon as well.
Kathy, I said as we boarded a Greyhound in Pittsburgh, Michigan seems like a dream to me now. It took me 4 days to hitchhike from Saginaw, and I've come to look for America.
All right, we're back. These are complicated times. You need good people in complicated times. So I am very lucky in that regard. Kat Pastor is there in the studio, making everything run so calmly. You cannot believe it. And I cannot believe it anyway. And Jonathan McPants is the producer of this particular episode. I'm not allowed to say what we're doing tomorrow anymore, but we're doing something tomorrow. I'm going to say it. I think we're going to have Bill Curry on. Get excited. And maybe your phone calls also. So, We're talking to Michael Lynch right now, professor of philosophy and director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Chicago, and the author of Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. Chris Murphy, we hope, will be joining us quite soon. And so, Michael, maybe I'm harping too much on the same thing, but I do feel that once again, we don't hear each other very well. And sometimes we're saying almost exactly the same thing with just one change. So, I sit there and go, what a terrible president. He's not going to do any of the things that doctors are saying to do. And there's this whole other contingent who are saying, what a great president. He's not going to let those doctors boss us around. Obama famously had Henry Louis Gates and the cop who tried to arrest him come to the White House and have a beer. And I know that's not really Trump's style, but it kind of is your style, right? There's a way in which I need to have a beer with the person who thinks that it's really cool that the president doesn't let the doctors boss us around. I don't know. Does that get us anywhere?
Yeah, well, I think it does. I think that those sorts of opportunities to have those beers, to have those cups of coffee with people that disagree with you are few and far between right now. And partly because, of course, passion and convictions are running so hot. I mean, I think one of the things that you're touching on is that, again, and we're finding this again, those of us on the left, that we're surprised at what's happened. And this is the theme that you're talking about. Well, part of that is due to the fact that we too have, and this is what David was noting, that people on the left are not immune from a certain type of intellectual arrogance where we think that we understand what the other side is thinking or believing. We think we understand the facts. We think we understand the electorate. We think we have good polling methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. But often and sometimes we do, but often our views on matters, just like everyone else, right? This is a human problem. Human beings are prone to become know-it-alls when passions run high. We're prone to think of ourselves as not needing to hear from the experience and evidence that other people might bring to the table. Now, I think, right now we have in the White House at the moment sort of the poster child for that sort of attitude. Somebody who is, who famously said, he's incredibly humble, as maybe more humble than anybody he's ever met. I mean, that's arrogance right there. The opposite of real humility. But
yeah, so he's probably not going to lead us up onto that hill. Michael, I just want to break in because Senator Murphy has just joined us, and he outranks both of us. So, U.S. Senator Chris Murphy, are you there?
I'm here.
There you are. Okay. So I think we need to just sort of start with nuts and bolts here. Obviously, it's starting to look like things are going to come down, maybe to the state of Michigan. Things are certainly going to come down to counts and recounts and legal challenges. How does the U.S. get through this with an outcome that is desirable and we can live with?
Yeah, we certainly live in a culture and a time of instant gratification in which we expect to be able to know things like election results within hours of the polls closing. That's not historically how things work in this country, and especially in a year like this where you've had all of these votes cast by absentee and, frankly, rules set that prevented those votes from being counted until today. It's kind of natural that we should have to wait. I feel pretty good about where Joe Biden's going to end up. Bob Casey, who's the senator from Pennsylvania, does believe that Biden's going to win Pennsylvania and perhaps win it with a pretty significant margin. Folks feel equally confident about Michigan. It may be that by the end of today, Biden can make some more definitive announcement, and Georgia is obviously still a wild card. And so, let's just imagine a world in which, Biden wins, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. Which I think is still a possible outcome. If you told most Democrats that that's how this thing was going to end up a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I think people would have been pretty satisfied. We obviously built up these expectations that we were going to win 538 electoral votes, and the consequence would be Donald Trump's head exploding and vanishing from American politics forever. Those were a little bit too high an idea of what was going to happen. If he wins, If Biden wins, then he's president, and that's a great thing for the country. And if he wins by a little bit of a margin, I think that's great too.
I like that scenario there. If the Senate thing doesn't work out, you should start writing for Saturday Night Live. So the head exploding was a great touch. So, on the other hand, and we know this from 2000 too, right? There's the conversation about how things turn up, how things are processed. If you follow the rules, if you do everything the right way, if you follow each line to its proper conclusion, how things wind up. And then there's the things that get said about it. There's the kind of competing narratives about what's actually happening here. And we have never had anybody. Bush and Gore had sort of differences of opinion, and Gore, maybe we should start with that. Gore ultimately decided, before he had expended every round of rhetorical and legal ammunition, that it was time to stop. I'm assuming that you're thinking that Vice President Biden should go way past that stop sign that made Gore stop, if in fact there is any such stop sign in this process.
Agreed. In this case, it is incumbent upon Vice President Biden to exhaust every remedy, every political remedy, every legal remedy. But it is not Joe Biden that's going to have to be on the offense here. It is, in fact, going to be President Trump, because it is likely that he's going to have to go to court with some sort of fantastically innovative legal theory to try to overcome what will likely be pretty big margins in the tens of thousands of votes in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And so the burden here is going to be on the president. And I just don't sort of see what legal theory he invents that frankly even ends up ever getting to the Supreme Court that could create a real legal challenge and legal problem here.
Let me ask you another question, Senator Murphy, which is, it looks as though Vice President Biden, as you say, has a path that he can follow, and certainly in the popular vote, he's probably going to exceed some of the performances that have preceded him. But, there was sort of another narrative, and I know that your party thought about taking back the Senate. That's clearly not going to happen. Enormous amounts of money was expended on a lot of races, which left Republican incumbents in place. And it looks as though, in fact, the House may, in fact, lose some net number of seats on the Democratic side to the Republican side. Is there a conversation that you can describe that needs to happen inside the Democratic Party about that? Is it a problem with message? Is it too much intramural bickering? Did the presidential debates kind of set up a narrative that scared people? What's your working hypothesis about all this?
Well, I don't have one yet, but I think it is really important for Democrats to do a full postmortem here, frankly, in a way that we didn't do after 2016. We were just, so immediately launched into building this resistance movement that we didn't have the chance to kind of sit back and, understand why this guy had gotten elected. And this year, there is substantial confirmation that Democrats are having a permanently hard time competing in portions of the country that we frankly need to win if we ever want to control the Senate again. And I don't yet have a fully sort of developed theory as to why that is, except this. Donald Trump managed to maintain a position as the outsider, even though he occupied the White House for 4 years. Joe Biden was, I think cast in many of these parts of the country as the insider candidate. And I think the Democratic Party, though we would sort of claim to be fighting against corporate interests and billionaire interests, haven't always walked the walk in the way that we talk the talk. And so I do think that we have to understand how upset people are at Washington, how upset they are at the status quo, and we have to decide whether we really are a party that unites around the kind of broad, revolutionary economic and political change that people want. That was obviously Bernie Sanders' attraction, but it also was Donald Trump's attraction, and I think that's a crisis inside the party that we have to figure out. How do we not become the party of the status quo, as I think in some parts we were viewed as being in the 2016 and 2020 election.
Right. I first of all, I think that's a great analysis. I would add to this that in a way, the party has kind of been trapped in two cycles now into running against Donald Trump and his ideas. And I do remember my son in 2016 talking about Sanders and saying, I know exactly what he stands for. I know exactly what his message is and what he thinks should happen. And I don't have that feeling about a lot of politicians, including Hillary Clinton at that time. So I don't know if you can sort of amplify that. Does the party need to have one message that is as crystal clear as what Sanders said? This will probably be the end of the show. So say something really stirring.
No, listen, I think we can't be afraid of big ideas, and we can't be afraid of calling out who's screwing ordinary Americans. I mean, listen, unfortunately, in this country, people do sort of think oppositionally, and Donald Trump had a lot of people to blame for what was happening to you. Democrats, not only have to have big ideas like Bernie Sanders has, and it would be great if we could be unified behind those big ideas, but also not be afraid to, call out the plutocracy in this country that is keeping a lot of people's wages absolutely frozen. And we just, we don't like talking in those terms in general as a party. We like subtlety and nuance, but I don't know that that's how voters make up their minds in the end. And so we're ultimately going to have to decide to meet them where they are rather than where some of the sort of progressive elites are.
All right, you left time on the clock, so I'll ask you. We only got 2 minutes left, though. McConnell is going to keep his position. Imagine that President Biden is inaugurated. How do you avoid gridlock now? How do you avoid the kind of gridlock that has stalled so many desirable things in Congress?
I mean, it's super frightening because I'm not sure why you wouldn't believe past will be predicate. In 2009, we were in the middle of an economic meltdown, and Mitch McConnell did everything he could to stop President Obama from being able to pass a recovery bill. Ironically, it was Susan Collins who, in the end, cast the 60th vote for that piece of legislation. I guess I, sort of have to believe that the same thing's going to happen again, that Mitch McConnell is going to, work against Joe Biden's efforts to try to control the pandemic and get the country back up and operating. The only counter narrative is this idea that there is a unique relationship between Biden and McConnell. And there is. They have worked together. They have passed compromise legislation together, and maybe Joe Biden can work some magic. But I know how McConnell has operated the entire time that I've been there. I think unless Biden is able to do something special inside that relationship, McConnell's going to end up acting like he has in the past. That's not a super encouraging way to think about the next 2 years, but McConnell is McConnell, and I'm not sure it is AG's changing.
All right, so now that is the end of the show. Chris Murphy is the U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut. We're also lucky to have Michael Lynch and David Folkenflik with us today. Azar Nafisi will come back as soon as she possibly can. Thanks to all of you who listened. Thanks to our guests. Thanks to our producer, Jonathan McPants. And we will be back tomorrow, possibly with Bill Curry. Get excited. Darn it, get excited.